Hello, mystery readers. I'm Alexandra Amore, and this is It's a Mystery Podcast. I'm here today with JF Penn. Hi, Joanna.
Hi, Alexandra. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's so great to have you here. So, for the uninitiated, I'll just tell them a little bit about you. JF Penn is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of thrillers with a supernatural edge. Oxford-educated, British-born, J.F. Penn has traveled the world in her study of religion and psychology. She brings these obsessions, as well as a love for thrillers and an interest in the supernatural, to her writing. Her fast-paced, arcane thrillers weave together historical artifacts, global locations, a kick-ass protagonist, and a hint of the supernatural. The London Psychic series, which is what we're going to talk about today, features British detective Jamie Brooke alongside psychic researcher Blake Daniel as they solve dark crimes around London. So, we're going to talk mostly about the London Psychic series today. I'm a big fan of police procedurals. And so these were the books of yours that I wanted to read the most. And I finished Desecration a week or so ago. So introduce us, tell us a little bit about Jamie Brooke. It was kind of heartbreaking to read Jamie's story, and I was curious about what drew you to her.
Yeah, it's funny. So I wanted to write a straight crime novel. That was what I went into this because my Arcane series is kind of action adventure. And I wanted, because I moved to London when I started writing this, I moved from Australia. I was back in London after, I think it was 11 years. And I wanted to do something in London. So that was kind of a first thing. I wanted to write a crime novel. And it's a bit of a longer story, but I'll do it anyway.
Yeah.
So I went to back in London. I'm excited about getting to know the city again, and I went to the Royal College of Surgeons along to a medical specimen museum. And you'll know from the book, the opening few scenes are set here as a dead body is found in the Royal College of Surgeons, surrounded by all the medical specimens. And when I visited that museum, I felt very disturbed by the whole atmosphere, and I decided that this visceral feeling was what I wanted to capture in a crime novel. So I really started with a setting, which is how I often write. Is that okay? What would be the weirdest thing in here? It would be a dead body, although we're surrounded by body parts. It would be someone who's actually been murdered, and then the interesting idea of all the who are the body parts in the jars anyway? Like, where do they even come from? And kind of thinking along those lines. So once I had the setting, then I was like, okay, so I need a policeman or a policewoman. And that was when I started thinking about Jamie. So for me, I write strong female characters. So it was probably always going to be a woman. And I don't even know how it happened that she had a child, and I think because I was thinking about bodies and the idea of the physical self versus the real self. So and it's not a spoiler at all to say that Jamie's daughter has a very severe illness and is in basically terminal care because of a genetic issue. So then you think, okay, so what does a career woman who's now like a single mum to a really sort of dying daughter, that sets the scene for all kinds of stuff. So I don't really know where she came from, except that she rides a motorbike, and I don't, but I would love to. And, she's kind of a kick-ass female character is what I always write. So, yeah, that's where she came from. And I don't have a daughter dying or not. So that was, I don't really know where that came from, but I think it's very important for the book that the daughter is there, and there's a lot of the plot that's to do with the daughter.
Yes, yeah. And how do you think Jamie is different than Morgan Sierra? Because Morgan Sierra is quite kick-ass too. And the one thing I noticed about Jamie is that because of what she's going through in the book, her walls are really up. And as the book progresses, they go up even further. And she says, in the book, in fact, that when people are trying to express sympathy to her at one point, that she can't even let that in. So I just wondered, what the differences were or similarities between Morgan and Jamie.
Well, I think partly, I don't know about other people, but I write as a sort of alter ego. to the main characters to try and figure out what I think about the world, and things, topics like the meaning of the physical body. I can only tackle that through writing a story about it, and actually thinking. So for me, Morgan Sierra was always more like James Bond,
Right.
less emotional resonance, really. She has a twin sister and a niece who she cares about, and a mentor and friends that she cares about, but she has sex in my books. Well, no, you don't see it, but there is, she has sexual encounters, as in Morgan Sierra is much more separate, I guess, and a sort of action figure, whereas Jamie has a real job. She's
Yeah.
more real life, I guess. She's a single mum, she smokes. She's got acquaintances, but it's really hard to find time to have friends when you've got a daughter in care, and a job as a detective sergeant, and everything. So, and there is a romantic element to her relationship with Blake Daniel, but they both are very scarred people, so that's a sort of longer story arc over the three books. So I think Jamie is, as you said, much more vulnerable, although she grows over the books. But I do really bad things to Jamie. I mean, she really has a tough time.
Yeah.
It's a tough role to play.
Yes, yeah. And so you mentioned Blake, so let's talk about him a little bit too. I was really intrigued by that character. And in the author's note at the end of the book, you talk about the idea that sparked this Blake's sort of talent. He's a reluctant clairvoyant, and he can touch objects and feel or see a bit of their history. So tell us a bit about him and what sparked that character.
Well, so when I really wanted to write a straight crime novel, because everything I'd written before had a supernatural element. And what was so crazy, I knew I needed like a sidekick character, someone to spark off, for Jamie to spark off. And what I just couldn't get this psychic idea out of my head. And I go to the British Museum a lot, and had been visiting a lot, and was kind of fascinated by the fact that all the objects in the museum, like if you were a researcher and you could somehow see the past of an object, that would make you a really cool researcher. and and then and also my sister-in-law is Nigerian. So my brother, who's white British like me, married a Nigerian, and so I've been thinking about mixed race characters. Wanting to bring the essence of London for me is mixed race. London's just elected a Muslim mayor, first European Muslim mayor, which is to me the melting pot of London. It's a character like Blake, who's half Nigerian, half Swedish, so it's a mixed race character. He kind of I kind of say he looks like a sort of dishevelled boy band. He's quite hot, really. And so the idea of a psychic, often in fiction, on TV as well as books, is a woman, right, and is mainly portrayed as a woman. And so I wanted a male character as a psychic who, I guess, and the problem is there isn't really a good word for it, but as you say, clairvoyant. But he really doesn't want to have this ability to touch things, and he's kind of jolted into the past. But what it gives me as an author is a chance to write historical chapters without writing a historical novel. So as a plot device, it's actually really good. And then what I wanted to do is kind of bring in that, what can he see in the past of the objects associated with the crime that could give Jamie clues, even though you could never use it in evidence. But because the police can't do that. Right. So I guess he was born from a sort of sense of wanting to include the museum, wanting to think about these objects, and this antique ivory figurine, which is like an anatomical Venus, was used to teach anatomy, back in the 16th, 17th century, and you could take the little body parts out, the little miniature, and it's quite weird, really. And so that it starts with that, but over the books, his ability to read the history of objects kind of plays into the story. And actually, I mean, and I have him in Day of the Vikings, which is a novella that spans both series, because Morgan Sierra goes to the museum and meets Blake Daniel, and
Oh,
so we get the history of the Viking kind of attacks on Britain in a modern thriller. So I actually, as Blake is a character, and to be honest, what's weird over it, so it's a trilogy.
yeah.
Desecration, Delirium, Deviance. I had thought I was going to write an ongoing crime series with Jamie. But what happened by the third book is she's actually left the police. She's a private investigator. Her arc pretty much winds up. But Blake, I think, will go on to be his own separate thing. And readers have said, are you taking Blake north, because there's stuff about his father and his history, and in Scandinavia. So I'm kind of like, I have this whole sort of new possible series with Blake, because I kind of find his ability quite addictive myself. It would be something I would love to have, and some people have it. And in fact, I have had psychics email me and say, how did you know how that felt? And I was like, well, I imagined it a bit like I imagine killing people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's called imagination. But it was great to kind of to get that right, because that's important.
Yes, exactly. Oh, that's amazing. That's fascinating. Nice to have that kind of feedback.
Mm.
And then you anticipated one of my questions, so I was going to ask if the books would carry on. So that's fantastic to know that Blake might take the books off in sort of another direction. And I can see that his talent would be such a good fit for you, because you're such a history buff and you love research so much.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was actually thinking the other day, why don't I write a historical novel? But I think for me, have you ever read any Barbara Erskine?
No.
No, well, there's an author called Barbara Erskine whose book Lady of Hay was the first one I read, and I think I read it when I was a teenager. It's quite, it's quite old now because I'm quite old. But she has this similar time track where she has one story in the present and one story in the past. I don't think I ever want to write pure historical, but as you say, I love having the modern day based on history in some way. So, and to me, the research process is kind of what I love most, or a part of the process is finding out all this cool information and doing that research. And like the three London psychic books, London, getting to know London at a different level was part of what made it so interesting.
I learned so much about London that I didn't know just from reading Desecration. So the caves under the city, I mean, that I thought you must be making this up. And then when I read the author's note, no, you weren't. And yeah, I know how much fun research is for you. And now that you don't live there, do you go back, or do you do most of it, your research online now, do you find?
Yeah, so my latest book, Destroyer of Worlds, is set in India, and we were in India a while back. So I've been writing other things. For Blake going north into Norway and maybe Iceland, I will plan a trip there. London, I think I finished the trilogy, so I finished the cycle of those three London books specifically.
Yeah.
Although in Destroyer of Worlds, I blow up Trafalgar Square in the first scene. So I think I will, and the Arcane headquarters is in London, so I will always bring London in a bit, but I feel like I've exorcised some kind of London addiction that I had with those three books. And I mean, like the last one, Deviance, is about the whole history of London being built on the sex trade, which is just fascinating how much of it is built on the backs of those women who are basically buried in a graveyard that's unconsecrated, because even though the bishop took the money from these women, and they weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. So the kind of these scandals that lie beneath London are so fascinating. But I've moved west, so I'm living in the West Country. There's a real sense of pagan England out west, so I'm quite near Glastonbury. Yeah. Which is, a big kind of weirdy place, quite near Wales, Stonehenge.
Yeah.
And so even, in fact, the other day I was I went to a church service. I took my my cousin's children to church for a thing, and we had this ancient ceremony where we circled the church and hugged the church, and it's called clipping with a Y. And I was like, I have never heard of this before. This is some kind of ancient pagan ritual that has been incorporated into the Christian service.
Wow.
I know. And I was just like, okay, that's going in my list of things to look at. So I'm actually thinking, and I've got another character in mind completely, a man this time, who will somehow investigate pagan mysteries that I'm starting to research. That's kind of what I'm looking at next. And so I think Where I'm Living Now will spark this whole different series of books. And I always have some kind of mystery aspect of thriller, aspect of supernatural, and this pagan England, which you think should be dead, is not dead.
No. Very cool. And speaking of research, then there are a lot of themes in Desecration that were quite dark, and things that go on that were disturbing. And do you ever have trouble letting go of what you've learned or seen? So, for example, you talk about the torture garden in Desecration, which is a real thing, a fetish club. And so when I was preparing for the interview, I went to the torture garden website, and there's a big warning on the front page. And so I actually backed away. I thought, if I'm a little bit vanilla myself, and I thought you can't unsee stuff. So what's that like for you? Are you ever troubled by what you learn?
It's a really good question, and let's just be clear: Torture Garden is a sex fetish club. It is not actually a place where people are like tortured.
No,
so
that's right.
we just want to make it clear to people, like it's an active lifestyle choice for people to go. Let me also say I never went. I did that one purely online. And also, like, my tattoo stuff and the skin trade that goes on in Deviance and the sex trade. I don't do everything that's in my books. Really important to say. But yeah, so I think the thing that sparked the whole series, this feeling of being disturbed when surrounded by specimens in a museum, that visceral feeling of being disturbed is kind of what I wanted people to feel, and then question why. Because that's I think the whole point of the book, is to say, why are we disturbed when there is a body part, say someone's leg, in a jar? Mm-hmm. Because I think most of us know that when you die, your body is not you. Mm-hmm. Whatever you believe, religion-wise, faith-wise, or nothing, I don't think we believe that we are the dead body. Yeah. The person is not left when the physical body is dead. So why, therefore, are we disturbed about what people do with the dead body? And I'm a donor, so I've basically said, when I die, take anything you want.
Right.
So why then do we still feel disturbed by babies in jars, for example? And it's sad in one way, but also the whole basis of our medical society is based on this type of research of doctors cutting into bodies and learning so that we can have an operation on a live body. So in terms of forgetting what I've seen, I think I almost wanted to try and go so deep into the process that I unlearned the feeling of being disturbed. It's like, okay, now I really understand why the body part is in the jar, how that helps me, how that helps, everyone. But also to fathom, why we're disturbed that way. So I use the Bodies exhibition in New York, which are plastinated corpses, corpse art, for example, which is just like, what? That's really weird and kind of disturbing. But the other thing is, I would say, just generally as a writer, for me, as soon as I've written it down, it's out of my head.
Oh, okay.
Yes, and I think this is why, like, I've interviewed quite a few horror writers. I don't think Desecration is horror. It is crime thriller.
Yeah.
There are some aspects of it, as you say, are a bit disturbing, but many crime novels have, disturbing aspects. And there's no torture porn as such, but when I talk to horror writers who do write a lot more graphic stuff, they're the nicest people. They really are, and the most psychologically healthy. And I actually think that when we exorcise our thoughts onto the page, they disappear. And I now, like, actively choose to visit specimen museums, and I really love all that, anatomy stuff, and anatomical history is just so fascinating. So that's kind of how I do it. And I sleep very well at night, and I'm fascinated by the macabre, I guess.
Right, okay. And then one final question I just wanted to talk about, because these books are police procedurals, and you do mention in the author note at the end of Desecration, that book is a little bit light on the whole procedural side, because Jamie actually is removed from the case partway through. But what was it like for you as an author doing research about how the police departments work? I've talked to other authors, an author recently, Daryl Donahue, who was a police officer, and so he's kind of got it made when it comes to writing about that kind of work. What research did you do to find out how an investigation takes place?
Well, so I wouldn't say that they're police procedurals. They
Oh,
are,
okay.
yeah, because they're basically, there is really only one scene that's kind of a crime scene, and that's the beginning. And I did research that, as in you can just do it on Google, like how does the police work, and how do they say warrant card, not and all this, the type of language. I also got a policewoman beta reader
Oh, okay, yeah.
to read it, and I mean, she told me things like that there's no way that these roles, you don't have enough people in your police team, there would be a lot more people. And I was like, do you know what, I don't want, if that's why true police procedurals have a lot more people who are police in them, whereas I wanted a kind of lone detective who's tackling the world on her own. Therefore, I almost remove her quite quickly, so that she's not even within the investigation aspect, although she then goes off and investigates on her own. I didn't want to necessarily create this whole sort of police force setup, because then it's often about interrelationships between various police officers, and I wanted her to kind of be a lone figure dealing with a lot of the stuff she has to deal with in the book. So that's probably why by the end of book 2 she is leaving the police, and I can't, that would be a spoiler as to why, but then she's a private detective in the 3rd book. So I started off thinking that I was going to write this standard crime police procedural, and I think as an author you have to be true to what your muse wants, and my muse can't get away from the supernatural. So essentially, that aspect of Blake's psychic ability, and in book 2, Delirium, we go much more into his sort of mind, and is he mentally ill, or is there he starts to see demonic things in these other realms, and that it's, I really kind of explore his aspect as well. So that's why I think I moved away from the idea of a police procedural. Also, it's because it's not what fundamentally interests me about it. The books are crime thrillers because essentially, at the end of the day, a crime book is about justice. It's about some crime happening and justice being served to the people involved. And that, to me, is done by over the periods of the books, justice is done. Therefore, it is a crime book. If not, there is a policewoman, but it's not really a police procedural.
Right, yeah. And really that suits Jamie's character so well, because she seems like such a kind of a lone wolf, very independent, and thoughtful about what she's doing, and so yeah, I just think it makes perfect sense that she would eventually leave the police force, really.
Yeah, and I think, and again, it's funny just saying, where do the characters come from? Both Jamie and Morgan, and this new character I'm thinking about, this male character, this lone wolf figure, I think is just characteristic of my work. My book Risen Gods, which is a dark fantasy, kind of completely different, does have 2 people, but each of them have their own journey until they meet, kind of. So it's I think that's just to do with me. I'm not a team player. Like, I haven't worked in the police. I haven't really worked, I've worked in jobs where I've been part of a team, but I think I'm much happier with these kind of lone wolf characters. Like I really like Jack Reacher. I like that kind of figure. So yeah, maybe that's why I keep writing them.
I bet it is, yeah. Well, this has been fantastic, Joanna. Thank you so much for being with me here today. So why don't you tell our listeners where they can find your books?
Sure. So most of my books are on ebook, print book, audiobook, and on all the usual places. Or you can go to jfpen, F for Francis, .com, so jfpen.com, and you can get a free ebook, Day of the Vikings, if you go to jfpen.com/free.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thanks for having me, Alexandra.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.